Hey there, I'm Joel Jamieson, 8weeksout.com and founder of the BioForce HRV system, and today I'm here to talk more about Energy Systems 101 in part 3 of our video series. Now, as you remember, what we talked about in the last video was that higher levels of aerobic energy production mean that you can maintain any given level of power output for longer. So if you have to produce 600 watts of power, if it's all coming from the aerobic side, you're going to be able to sustain that a whole lot longer than if half is coming from the aerobic side and half is coming from the anaerobic side. And that basically just tells us that the anaerobic power reserve concept we talked about in the last video is the fundamental way the body works and how your body dictates how long it can produce energy for. Okay, we also talked about the fact that greater anaerobic energy production means you can produce more power, of course, but again, that comes with that trade-off. And then finally, we talked about conditioning depends on how your body produces energy, but also how you choose to use that energy. So today we're going to talk about the aerobic side of things, which of course, as we've been discussing so far, is the important part if your goal is to extend the duration and how long you can sustain power output for. Now, the great thing about the aerobic system is it's incredibly flexible and adaptable. And what I mean by that is the aerobic system has the most capability to improve. And the reason is because there's so many working parts to the aerobic system. There's a lot of different areas that can be improved. We can improve oxygen supply. So we can improve basically how much oxygen the heart can pump, how much oxygen the lungs can process. We can improve how much capillaries and different blood vessels. We can improve a lot of things on the supply side. Secondly, we can also improve a lot of things in oxygen utilization. So we can improve the muscle's ability to draw oxygen out of the blood and to utilize it effectively. And then third, we can change substrate availability, which includes things like enzymes and how your body breaks down the different energy substrates it uses to produce aerobic energy. So again, the great thing about the aerobic system is it's incredibly adaptable. It's very flexible and you can improve at great lengths. You can take somebody who literally spends half their day on the couch and get them running a marathon, at least at some level within several months of training. You can't take somebody who has no training experience and get them, lifting extremely heavy weights or producing high levels of anaerobic power nearly the same rate because it's much more limited. There's much more genetics involved in the anaerobic side, and there's less room for flexibility and adaptability. So when it comes to aerobic training, there's some basic principles that are going to apply. I'm going to cover some methods here of aerobic training, but again, any different method can be used, and there's zillions of them out there, as long as they stick to this general principle. First, the majority of time that your heart rate is being developed or training, you should see the majority of time spent at or below your anaerobic threshold. You can only spend so much time above it before you're going to fatigue, and you generally are not going to get in a ton of volume when you're spending very much time above the threshold. So majority of time in aerobic training, now this doesn't apply 100% of the time in every scenario, but across the board for most of the time, your heart rate should average below your anaerobic threshold during aerobic type training. Okay, the second thing is that the lower the intensity, the higher the volume. So if you're walking very slowly, that's obviously going to take massive volumes to see any real improvement. Now obviously we don't walk for workouts, but that same principle applies. If we're doing lower intensity training, we do need higher volumes. And this is the downside or the other side of the aerobic coin. To develop aerobic system to high levels, you need more volume of training than the anaerobic side. And this is why endurance sport athletes obviously train for huge volumes. Endurance athletes run and cycle and swim and do these things for lots and lots of hours because that's what it takes to develop the system to the highest levels. Now, unless you're specifically competing in one of these sports and you need that sort of development, it doesn't mean you have to do that much volume. But in general, to develop the aerobic system means more volume and more frequency than the anaerobic side. Part of this is just because the body adapts much quicker and the body has to have much more continual stimulus to maintain those aerobic adaptations. So you have to have a higher volume of training because the intensity is inherently lower. That's just how aerobic training and the body works. Okay, finally, aerobic fitness has gotten a bad rap, and people have been discussing for the last few years that you only need high intensity interval training, and that's all you should do year round if you really want to improve your maximum fitness levels, aerobic fitness. Now, the reality is, and I can tell you after years of working with the best combat athletes in the world, consulting with teams and organizations and really getting out there and working with thousands of athletes, the biggest thing to understand is that both aerobic and steady state have a place, just in that high intensity and low intensity both serve a purpose in the yearly training cycle. Now, I'm not advocating you go out and take football players or anaerobic athletes, sprinters, short sprinters, and have them run miles on end. That's not what I'm saying. But as a yearly part of the training program, there's reason to incorporate both higher and lower intensity training methods. Now let's talk about the first lower intensity training method that most people are familiar with. They'd call that road work or LSD or whatever you want to call it. But lower intensity, slower aerobic training has a role in performance and many people's programs. How much you need to do, how often you should do it, and what part of the year you should do it in depends entirely on your sport and your specific needs. So the biggest thing when you talk about cardiac output or LSD, you want your heart rate around 130 to 150. Somewhere between 30 and 90 minutes is a good example or a good amount of time for most people. And I personally prefer to use what I call roadwork 2.0 circuits. You can find more about that on my website, AEROBIC.com. But the general principle is that you want to incorporate circuit-based type aerobic activities. You might jump rope for 10 minutes. You might use a medicine ball and do a medicine ball workout for 10 minutes. You might jog for 10 minutes. You might ride a bike for 5 minutes. You might push the sled for 10 minutes. The point is you can use different activities at lower intensities to get the same effect. There's no reason to be extremely repetitive and just go out and run miles on end, because that is where you can cause damage to the joints if you do too much of it. It's better to be more multidimensional and use different exercises in a varying fashion to achieve the same thing. And again, this is cardiac output. It develops the size of the left ventricle, makes your heart bigger, more efficient. It helps develop the blood vessel network, and it helps the slower twitch fibers become more effective at utilizing oxygen. It's an important method to use, but again, its importance and where it gets placed in your workout and how much you do of it depends entirely on what your needs are, what your sport is, and what part of the year it is. You're going to consider things a lot different early off season versus in season versus you're not an athlete at all and you're just training for health and wellness. You always have to take the context of what you need when considering which methods to use. The next method that I use quite a bit of is called tempo intervals. And tempo intervals are essentially a low to moderate intensity type of interval. And the benefits to them is you're going a little bit faster than the LSD or the slower stuff, so you're going to start building more of the fast twitch fibers and they're building their endurance, but it's not going to be so fatiguing that you're going to wear yourself out. In other words, you can do more of these than a high intensity interval and do them more frequently without overtraining or causing injury. The way you simply do them is 8 to 10 seconds of work and about 60 seconds of rest. Now the key is that you're not sprinting 100% for those 8 to 10 seconds. You're sprinting at about a 70% pace. So whatever pace you can go 100%, take around 70% of that speed, and that should be your pace for tempo intervals. Somewhere between 8 to 16 reps is typical. And again, you can do these 2 or 3 times a week without incurring a great deal of fatigue. And you might say, well, this isn't going to make me faster. This isn't going to make me more explosive. Well, I have to tell you, Charlie Francis, who is the late coach of Ben Johnson and several other sprinters who developed many of the world's fastest athletes back then, used tempo intervals exclusively on his low days. His high-low system was used, and tempo intervals are one of his favorite. I use it with many of my combat athletes, and it's a great way to help your athletes build endurance in a way that's not going to break them down, in a way that's going to help support their higher intensity training. Because again, no one's saying you do just low intensity training, but you need to do some of it, and you want to make sure that the low intensity training you do doesn't take away from the higher intensity training that you're going to need to do as well. So you don't want to cause fatigue, and that's where tempo intervals can come into play and be an effective asset. All right, finally, we're going to talk about a method called high resistance intervals. And this is essentially a method of now we want to start working the fast twitch muscle fibers, improving their endurance. And the way they're going to do it is by very high resistance or very high load of some sort. We're going to do very short work of 5 to 6 seconds, and then we're going to rest about 60 seconds until heart rate comes down to about 130 to 140. Now what I mean by high resistance or high load is, for example, sprinting up a steep hill. The reason we want to sprint up that steep hill is because the incline is going to place more load, which causes our faster twitch fibers to get involved. Now, obviously, the super fast twitch fibers don't last very long, so we keep the duration short, 5 to 6 seconds, and then we are able to rest and let them come back to normal and recover, and then we do them again. But keeping the rest intervals longer and keeping the work intervals shorter, we're able to do a higher volume of these. So typically, you could do anywhere from 15 to 25, sometimes even more of these reps over time as you improve your ability to do them. But they're a great way to build those faster twitch fibers, the endurance, I should say, those faster twitch fibers, which ultimately leads to greater aerobic fitness and improved overall conditioning. To sum things up, increasing aerobic fitness, it's going to lead to an increased endurance or an ability of your body to produce energy for longer. And again, it's not just for endurance sports. If you're in a sport that requires a high level of aerobic fitness, which we talked about is basically any event or sport that requires more than a couple minutes of power output, you're going to need to have a relatively high level aerobic fitness to do well. Now, if you're not an athlete, but you just want to stay in shape, you want to be healthy, obviously there's been research paper after research paper that shows the benefits of having a well-developed cardiovascular system for your overall health and wellness. That's a whole other topic, but it's just important for the average person, if not more important than it is for the athletes. Because as we said, energy systems are about survival and about health. They're not about performance per se. Okay. Secondly, we talked about the fact that the aerobic system is the most adaptable. It's able to be trained more than the anaerobic systems, and it allows us to greatly improve it because it's got so many working parts that we can improve over time through proper training. Okay, and again, there's lots of different aerobic methods you can use. I just outlined a few short ones, but as long as they stay true to those key principles we talked about in terms of the overall heart rate, in terms of frequency and whatnot, as long as it adheres to those basic principles, it can be an effective method. The key is to figure out which methods are necessary for you to improve, and then how do you arrange and manage those within a training program to get the most out of them. All right, so that wraps this video up, and then the next one we're going to talk about the anaerobic side and how you can improve your anaerobic fitness through specific methods as well.